Feeling thirsty for knowledge? Hackers on the Rocks is the podcast that mixes refreshing conversation with potent cybersecurity insights. Serving up these insights with a twist, we pair a different software vulnerability with a refreshing cocktail recipe each episode. Hello, world, and greetings all around. Today, we are joined by Michael Horka, and we are going to get super nerdy and talk about NetFlow. Michael's going to help us understand what even is NetFlow, how it's used, and we'll share some unexpected findings he has been able to pull from this data. Michael, welcome to Hackers on the Rocks.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right, let's level set here. What is NetFlow?
So NetFlow is a protocol for analyzing network traffic. For most predominantly, people recognize it as like the five tuples who got source and destination IP addresses and source and destination ports. You know, that also sometimes includes byte counts, directionality, that sort of stuff for tracking more session-based activity. But NetFlow is used for a ton of purposes. It's used for diagnostics. It's used for network monitoring. It's used for, for network defense efforts, blocking on firewalls, that sort of stuff. So lots of different use cases for it.
Yeah, and I think to me, like the diagnostical piece makes sense, right? You're capturing, it doesn't sound like you're capturing content, right? Like this is not like a TCP dump with like full packet capture. This is, I think you said statistical modeling. Is that generally right?
Correct. Yeah. So yeah, there's no content. It's metadata about the flow traffic. So you can identify where traffic's going, when it was going. So essentially like the who, what, when, where, and sort of the how of network traffic. But nothing else. Yeah, you don't get the full content. You don't know exactly what's going on, but you can make pretty good determinations from like a 10,000 foot view of what that NetFlow is telling you.
And so this doesn't strike me as intuitively built for security operations, right? I think you said something about like looking for like bottlenecks and like other like networky type stuff. Like, is the security aspect that we're going to talk about today novel and unique, or is it like really, are there actual security applications that are commonly used through NetFlow?
Yeah, I mean, I think looking back at the history of NetFlow, it definitely started. I mean, I believe it was Cisco who kind of developed that protocol, but it was essentially like began as more of a diagnostic tool, but I think it was picked up for security purposes pretty quickly. I don't know exactly when, but it has been used in network defense applications for quite some time now. So it's definitely not anything that's new, but the degree of which people are able to collect and hold a NetFlow scales dramatically. It takes up a ton of disk storage, and there's lots of people who just don't have the capability or capacity to be able to collect NetFlow at scale, especially across all of their endpoints. You've got cloud architecture now where folks just don't have edge devices sitting in front of the cloud architecture. They're reliant on third parties to be able to provide that data, which most of the time they don't. So there's lots of variables now that make it difficult to always include NetFlow in as part of your security plan.
Yeah, and real quick, kind of before we move on to those aspects, you mentioned that NetFlow is a Cisco brainchild, and I guess my question is like, knowing what I know about Cisco, do you have to run Cisco hardware, or are there like, is NetFlow implemented everywhere, or are there like equivalent open source, or is this talk limited to Cisco shops?
No, definitely not Cisco limited at this point. I mean, it was only when the protocol was first introduced, and I don't even know exactly when that was. I don't know if it was in the 90s, but it's been around for a while, and the application has expanded far beyond Cisco devices.
All right, we'll talk about security in a second, but I'm getting thirsty. Are you thirsty?
I'm thirsty.
Yeah. What are we drinking today, man?
Old Fashioned.
Ooh. All right. Tell me about this Old Fashioned.
So it's 2 shots of Bulleit, and then some bitters, a couple dashes of bitters, and a little bit of simple syrup, and Luxardo cherry. And that's about it. I'm a big bourbon whiskey drinker, but sometimes it's nice to just have something that's a little bit smoother and colder than just straight whiskey.
Yeah, fair enough. And so, I mean, you were very specific, right? So I heard Bulleit, and I heard, Lux cherries. Is Bulleit your go-to?
Usually for when I'm doing old fashions, yeah, Bulleit is the go-to.
Fair enough. If you're not doing old fashions, what's on the agenda for you?
I love Weller, and I think that it kind of depends on what I'm looking for. So it's a hard question to answer.
Fair enough. All bourbons then, or are we moving into the rye category, or how are we doing it?
Yeah, ryes too. Yep.
Rock on. All right. Well, cheers to you, man.
Cheers.
Mm. All right. So I want to get back. I think maybe let's start with the differentiation between NetFlow and TCP dump, because I've always heard, guests on the show are always talking about, if, starting from a research perspective, ground truth is a lot easier when you have the actual, the actual packets, all of the actual traffics. Can you maybe first start by contrasting NetFlow with TCP dump, or, just packet capture in general, why you'd pick one strategy versus the other, and maybe articulate why or how NetFlow can be used either in different ways or in superior ways than just capturing everything?
Sure. I mean, I think the biggest thing is going to be scalability by far. I mean, that's being able to collect NetFlow at scale is not only easier, but it's also something that it's more widely accepted. First off, it's a lot easier to ingest into SIMs. PCAP has a ton of protocols embedded within it, just full content capture that require various different parsers and a ton of different knowledge. So there's not a whole lot of platforms that just fully ingest PCAP. And honestly, even when they do, they tend to extract NetFlow from the PCAP. They extract the 5-tuple and the byte counts. Or they extract the same values that you can pull from NetFlow, and then they make that available in an index that you can search through. So, absolutely, full content capture or PCAP is always going to be like you said. I think you said the ground truth. I mean, that is the ideal collection method. It's just not sustainable for most organizations and network vendors to be able to do that. Certainly not at the scale that Lumen is collecting it, since it's across the global backbone for us. But even for smaller organizations, it's too massive. So NetFlow tends to be a little bit more of a default for when people are able to capture anything.
Got it. And since you volunteered this, I'll kind of just bring this up a little bit. You have a unique perspective on this, almost as an authority figure, right? You are with Lumen, and I'm imagining Lumen does a lot with NetFlow based on maybe can you share a little bit about what Lumen is, like who they are and what they do?
Yeah. So Lumen is a telecommunications company, but they're also a global technology company. They operate the number one most peered global autonomous system out there, the level 3356 ASN. What that means essentially is that there is just a ton of network visibility on the backbone. So we pull in over 200 billion flow records a day and over 1 billion DNS records a day. So it's a ton of flow to look through. I'm kind of referencing back to the PCAP. That would be massive if it wasn't just the NetFlow records. But Black Lotus Labs is within Lumen Technologies, and Black Lotus Labs' job is we're the threat research arm of Lumen. So we do the analysis of that data, of that NetFlow data.
And just real quick before we start talking about that analysis, since I've heard you say this now twice, this concept of a 5-tuple, can you share with our audience what a 5-tuple means?
Yeah, sorry, I keep referencing that. It's essentially just there's different forms of NetFlow, but the most common that people are familiar with is a 5. It's called a kind of just the typical 5-tuple, but that essentially just means source IP, destination IP, source port, destination port, and protocol. That NetFlow, various different forms of NetFlow include additional info, including bytes transferred, and you can extract directionality out of that sometimes. So there's different things that get tacked on to NetFlow, but like the most basic form of it is what people refer to as that 5-tuple. Those 5 values are always present.
Got it. All right. And I think that's a good foundation now. So maybe we can shift into Lumen, Black Lotus. You're collecting a ton. I think it was like 200 billion flow records is what you said, which is amazing.
Yeah.
PCAP doesn't scale. Got it. So now we're talking about the analytics behind what you can extract out of these 5 tuples, which again are sessionized summaries, I guess, is probably the best way, since you're not grabbing the actual content, you're just grabbing the flow. How can NetFlow be used for security purposes?
Yeah, in a variety of ways. Kind of depends on what you're doing. I mean, if you're on the network defense side of the house, then you're using NetFlow. You typically will pull stuff in from your firewalls or your edge devices. You're using NetFlow to look for malicious traffic. You can use it to corroborate if you see internal traffic and you work your way out to the edge, identify malicious IPs. You're able to query your NetFlow to see all the inbound traffic from those malicious IPs. You can potentially get signatures set up based on patterns of traffic. Maybe you see, you're getting hit with a ton of exploitation traffic from vulture IPs or something, and you can use NetFlow and some IP enrichment, ASN enrichment data to be able to block based on that information. So from the network defense side of the house, it's extremely useful. Also from forensics, incident response, like having NetFlow for during and or after an intrusion is extremely beneficial when you're looking back on what occurred. Being able to see bytes transferred is huge. A lot of times with disk-based artifacts, you're just going to lose a ton of valuable insight. From the forensic standpoint, you won't see if threat actors exfiltrated a ton of data because they just deleted all the logs on disk. But the NetFlow doesn't lie. You can, like you always can see, like if there was X amount of bytes transferred out, like you're able to still make an assessment based on how much data maybe it was lost. Now for threat research teams, it's kind of a different angle. A little bit of the same since we still feed, of course, like Lumen network defense efforts, but our role is more of like a hunt. We're hunting for threat actors. My team in particular is for advanced persistent threats, APT threat actors, but there's a ton of other, techniques for hunting for obfuscation networks and botnets that these APT actors are operating over, as well as pivoting off of known infrastructure. So lots of applications.
Yeah. So maybe we can dig in a little bit. So I understand very clearly, I think you mentioned like volume analysis. If we're seeing a lot of traffic going from a network somewhere else, that could be an indication of exfiltration. And like you said, the network doesn't lie. And so now you've got some good data backing up. Again, you won't necessarily be able to know what has left, but you can, I think with pretty high confidence, say this is an abnormal movement of like this volume of data, and that's helpful. You mentioned earlier that you can use NetFlow to determine malicious IPs, and I'm curious how you do that if all you're seeing is computer A talks to computer B. How do you determine that an IP address is malicious from NetFlow?
So that'll be another, it depends, but if it's a hunt effort, it's much more difficult. So, and by hunt effort, I just mean if you're starting with no known bad, then it is more difficult to do that purely from a NetFlow standpoint, definitely. Now, we do have some analytics for trying to suss out botnet type of architectures out on the internet from nothing, like looking at communications from certain device types, like Soho device, small office, home office devices, routers, home routers, communicating, like let's say we've got a set of 400 ASIS devices that we see communicating to a single VPS at a DigitalOcean or something. Things like that where we can run some analytics that will at least assess with like a moderate degree of confidence, like that doesn't seem legitimate. Nothing's 100% locked in at that point, but you can make good assessments based on how suspicious traffic looks. Now, it gets easier, a little bit easier when you start talking about less about the hunt effort and more about pivoting. So let's say even just looking at like recent ODA comes out for Fortinet devices or something, IPs get released. We can analyze those. Those are presumably malicious. We didn't identify those, but they're presumably malicious. And we can try to work upstream and look at inbound connections to those devices. Can we identify, were they part of an obfuscation network? Was it just ad hoc infrastructure being used by these threat actors? If it is part of an obfuscation network, maybe we can identify some tier 2 traffic, like management type of traffic over these hosting providers that they're using to target the end devices that were used for the Fortinet ODA. So it all just depends. Lots of different uses.
I know back in the day, the big thing was like signatures, right? And so you can create, I mean, it's still a big thing. I would say it was only back in the day, but right, if you know what a particular exploit does on the wire and you capture a sample of it being thrown, you can create patterns of ones and zeros, assuming encryption is kind of pulled away, and determine that this packet itself is malicious. You said earlier also, like you can see, I think you used the term vulture IPs for tracking exploitation. And again, maybe I'm just still not quite clear with the summation data, right? NetFlow is just the headers, right? Those 5 tuples, the source and destination IPs and ports and protocols. You can maybe infer that something is malicious because it coincides with the news being released that you said like a Fortinet ODA drops or something. But how do you know for sure that from NetFlow data alone that certain sessions are either exploit traffic or malicious?
So to directly answer that, the answer is we don't know for sure. And I'm not sure we can ever say with like 100% certainty that that's what that is. So that is absolutely a caveat with NetFlow. You don't always have that when you're looking at application and system logs on a device, and you can confirm with certainty that they exploited a vulnerability to access this device. NetFlow doesn't provide that for you. So we're definitely like always working in a gray area with NetFlow. The big advantage with NetFlow though is I think I mentioned this earlier, but it's the scalability. So while we may not be able to say with 100% certainty that this one victim was compromised, we can say with 70 to 75% certainty that these 50 victims were compromised, because we can work upstream and then work our way back down and see all the exploitation activity. So yeah, I mean, I think it's not always clear, but usually at the pace that threat actors are operating at, that 70 to 75% clarity is, or confidence is enough to work with at the time.
Yeah, it's funny, like I'm becoming a believer, right? It seems like looking at NetFlow is probably a smart strategy. Maybe you can comment a little bit, like here's where I'm not at the I believe yet stage. You representing Lumen, like you're an ISP. I think you mentioned you're like an ASN, you're peering everywhere. You have the ability and the resources to, again, not just track, hey, point A to point B, but again, like I said, swim upstream, because you're in this weird collection spot where you can see all of this stuff. Does NetFlow become maybe less useful for end users? You know, I've got my own corporate network and that's it, or my own home network, or like at what point does NetFlow maybe break down because of the lack of the volume or the ability to couple, like you said, like sometimes you'll get some prior intelligence just again because of who you are, where someone will say like, hey, there's this new thing and here's kind of what it looks like, or here's a block of IPs that we think are bad, and now you've got like a good starting point. Like does all of this magic happen simply because of Lumen's reach?
Yes, partially. Absolutely. You know, Lumen's uniquely positioned to be able to collect and analyze NetFlow at that scale. It doesn't diminish the value for network defenders. There's absolutely 100% value in collecting NetFlow in front of your edge devices for network defenders of corporations, organizations, whatever. Now, they're not going to be able to expect to do like threat hunting efforts looking for botnets and obfuscation networks out beyond their perimeter, of course. So it's kind of more about just knowing what you have. Like Lumen's uniquely positioned to be able to look through that on a global scale. Organization X that decides to collect NetFlow at their edge devices, they've just got to have the understanding that like what they're collecting is for their own purposes. And it's absolutely worth collecting because they're going to be able to see everything inbound to their own infrastructure, but they're not going to be able to run global hunts across, you know, like geographically disparate devices and infrastructure.
Yeah, I guess in your expertise then, is the value for a smaller operator, again, someone that's only responsible for one's network or like a small pairing of like, I'll call them vanilla, you know, clients. Something you said earlier about like baselining behavior through anomaly detection is, I mean, that, especially with like machine learning technology, I feel like that sounds like a pretty viable pathway, like for like mere mortals and not ASN operators to run like some kind of NetFlow analysis. Is that how a consumer would generally leverage NetFlow?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It all depends on how much effort you want to put into it. I mean, some people, I mean, I used to work for the FBI, and when I worked with victim organizations, I mean, a lot of the times, or not a lot of times, but sometimes when they did have NetFlow, they often didn't look through it a ton. It was more from a forensic collection standpoint. They just wanted to make sure that they had like 30 days of NetFlow available for analysis. So, you know, it scales all the way from let's just collect and not look at it unless we need to, like it's a safety net, all the way through people running full anomaly detection analytics across. I know that 95% of my user base is logged into the VPN from 9 to 5 Eastern time. Why did Joe log in at 1 a.m. to the VPN? You know, it's like things like that, just general anomalies, like that's the sort of stuff. And you can pull that off sometimes through application logs as well, and VPN logs and login activity, but NetFlow allows you to be able to do that at the network level and not just at the application level.
Yeah, it's almost like I know when we talk about malware, the guests will often talk about like living off the land and not trying to stick out, and it's almost like with these these traffic collection technologies that's full again PCAP and through like Wireshark or TCP dump, those tools to analyze the collection, or some kind of, again, some digest. I'll just call NetFlow like a digest approach. It seems like if you're trying to like beacon to a C2 server over like an obscure ephemeral port, that's going to stick out a lot more than if you just beacon out over like HTTPS.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and it does, but there's also there's a ton of noise on the internet, and when you look through global NetFlow, you start to realize how much weird stuff there is on the internet, and it seems like it would be like a simple problem to solve, but it is definitely harder than it looks.
Yeah, was it on the internet? No one knows you're a dog, right? Is that the old New Yorker cartoon? All right, so maybe can you give an example of maybe a practical example of using NetFlow to track threat actors or find some kind of capability that I think NetFlow derived the ability to hunt that down? Are there good concrete examples that you can share?
Yeah, I mean, we've got several blog posts out there on everyone should definitely read through. I mean, great examples of how we use NetFlow to tackle problems, identify threat actors, identify obfuscation networks and botnets. I mean, one of the more recent ones is Raptor Train that was operated by Flax Typhoon, and it was a multi-tiered botnet. One of the cool things about that network in particular was that we were able to break out all the different tiers. So I kind of talked earlier about how maybe we identify some malicious activity coming out of compromised Soho devices, but then we're able to work upstream. We can find the tier 2 level C2 devices, or C2 servers, the payload servers, exploitation servers, et cetera. And then we can work again up to tier 3. And we found the management servers that were actually doing distributed management of like 40 plus C2 servers that were active at the time. So that sort of visibility is something that is extremely unique and only really possible looking at things from global NetFlow scale, especially when you consider the fact that Soho devices are in the US and Taiwan, and then you've got the mid-range devices are actually pretty spread out geographically, like across the world. I think about half of them were in the US, but otherwise they were all over the place. And then the management servers were predominantly based out of like Singapore. So you've got, if you don't have that type of visibility, then, that's tough to identify. But when you do have it, that's the sort of power in looking through global NetFlow.
Yeah, it's almost like maybe my original premise of like, I just own and operate this like small business network and maybe it's less useful for me. It sounds like the inverse of that is true for you, where again, like I have like you said, from my ISP at my house, I'm provided with some kind of a device which may or may not be NetFlow compatible, but if it is, maybe my ISP is able to, over a wider network, look at trends and see is my geographic, because I'm imagining all of my neighbors have the same ISP or close to it, right? And like, are there trends of compromise in a certain region or asset class or stuff that I wouldn't be able to deduce? Like finding the needle in the haystack is hard when it's just my network and I don't really know what I'm looking at. But from the ISP perspective, being able to aggregate all of the clients, big and small, I think that's a really powerful statement. Having just been a big fan of all the Lumen publications and Black Lotus over the years, I'm really glad that you guys are so public with the fact that you again, unapologetically are absolutely collecting stuff and then reporting on it. And there are many instances of finding things that are harder to find that you didn't have to. Like no one's paying you to do it. No one's expecting you to do it, and you're doing it anyway. So I'm not a Lumen customer. I'm not a shareholder or anything, but like, thank you for all of the good, well-written documents over the years. You and the team are doing a fantastic job.
Yep, absolutely.
Maybe we can just shift to last call on this, Michael. Is there anything about NetFlow, finding data in NetFlow, using its tips and tricks for the listeners that you'd want to add before we kind of wrap up for today?
Yeah, I mean, I think another thing that when you had brought up examples I hadn't really touched on was we had released a blog on Volt Typhoon's exploitation of the Versa 0 day. And I mean, I think there's some really good, unique examples of usage of NetFlow that we took advantage of in that particular instance. So we identified a web shell in VirusTotal actually through a signature that we'd written, and it was highly tailored to VersaDirectors systems. VersaDirectors are centralized management for Versa's SD-WAN, a software-defined wide area network platform. But once we identified that it was specifically targeted to VersaDirectors, we were able to enumerate VersaDirectors that were openly exposed on the internet. And then through NetFlow, looking at those IPs that we knew to be associated as VersaDirector systems, we were able to look for anomalies across a smaller subset of those systems. So we knew where to start because of the web shell and likely zero-day exploitation. And then we're able to kind of uniquely use NetFlow on a global scale to say, all right, let's look for anomalies across this wide range of VersaDirector systems. There was a ton deployed at telcos and at IT providers, MSPs. And through that, we were able to see there were two management ports, port 4566 and 4570, but they were essentially high availability pairing ports for the VersaDirectors. So you would expect to see VersaDirector communications across those ports to maintain high availability of those systems. Interestingly, again, uses of NetFlow, when you look at that and you enrich it with some device type enrichment, of course, a ton of traffic between all the different VersaDirectors. But then there's a home router that's communicating with on that port, established TCP session, pretty short time frame, but still it just lights up like a Christmas tree. There's only 7 or 8 VersaDirectors on the internet over the last 30 days that are showing that indicator. And then we go look at those, and of course, what we see the short interactions with this management port followed up with significant flows over port 443, which would be indicative of them interacting with a web shell that they've dropped on those VersaDirector systems. It just definitely it is very unique use cases for global NetFlow in particular to try to pivot out on indicators that you initially have, like something like a web shell or VirusTotal. It's kind of just thinking outside the box and thinking of ways that you can do those hunts, looking for things that aren't obvious. Like, of course, if you get malicious IPs, that you can obviously pivot on those, but thinking through more broad ways of doing hunts is definitely a unique way to take advantage of NetFlow.
Yeah, I think broad question, when you're seeing, hey, these Versa SDN appliances are being victimized, does Lumen ever make the business decision to get involved in the advisory process of hey, we're seeing this, be on the lookout, or perhaps, hey, we see you have one of these devices, you should probably do something about it? Or is that someone else's responsibility?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, first off, we engage with U.S. law enforcement whenever we see any potential indication. Again, it wasn't 100% because, like we talked about earlier with NetFlow, it's never 100%, but we had that 70% confidence. So we engaged with U.S. law enforcement to notify of a potential ODA being actively exploited. And then we also engaged with Versa Networks to confirm that it was an ODA and to get that patched, which we did. They went through that whole cycle, and then we waited to release our information until after I believe it was a 30-day window passed from their initial security notice and patch. So they had multiple times where they notified customers and got them patched, and then we released that information for a more broad audience. So yeah, we absolutely do that. We engage if we have any zero-day exploitation. We absolutely engage with both the provider and with any other public and private sector partners we need to.
Yeah, rock on. Going backwards, since you brought it up, it's kind of a thing we do on the show, right? You mentioned all this identification of web shells. But can you tell our audience what is a web shell?
Yeah, a web shell is a piece of malware that is dropped on web servers. That's where the web comes from, and it is exposed through web servers as a web resource that threat actors can access. It's essentially a backdoor into the web server, so they can issue commands and upload and download files depending on the functionality built into the web shell, but various different things that they can take advantage of through this backdoor that gives them access into the web server.
Rock on, thanks. Yeah, maybe just kind of in wrapping up, I think it seems like what I really like about this is you have, I know it's Cisco derived, but essentially it's this open protocol. It's implemented on all these devices now, and it's accessible, right? It's plain text. It compresses really well. And for the researchers in the audience, it sounds like if there's enough creativity and the ability to identify various patterns, really all you're doing is writing the search tools to extract out of all of this data, those needles in the haystack. And it sounds like you could find a lot of really neat things. Like you said, the internet's like a wild, crazy place. And it just seems like for researchers, like this is a potential gold mine that perhaps people are not thinking about often enough.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a ton of opportunity there. We definitely, I won't sugarcoat it. Lumen's definitely uniquely positioned in the amount of NetFlow that we have. So I certainly don't want to make it seem like, folks can just spin up some NetFlow collection on their edge and be able to replicate that type of visibility. But you are able to do very similar hunt efforts across NetFlow collection at the edge.
Thank you, Michael. Last call. Where can the audience go to find out more about you, your work, or anything you mentioned today?
Yeah, so Lumen's Black Lotus Labs has our blog. We put out a ton of content on there. Not everything that we're working, so absolutely reach out if you want to work in a threat tracking capacity. Some sharing, we can absolutely do that. We also have a LinkedIn that we have been pretty frequently posting on. That's pretty new. That's new in the last year or so. Where we're trying to do more like rapid updates. So if you see stuff pop on there, that's kind of a platform that we're doing that on. But yeah, a couple different areas to look for.
Awesome. Michael, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for the Bulleit Old Fashioned, and cheers to you, man.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you.